One of the primary ways of illuminating a scene is with light objects, such as these photometric rectangle lights. The other primary method is through the 3ds Max scene environment. That environment light source can be anything from a flat color to a high dynamic range image to a daylighting system. The simplest form of environment is a flat color, so we'll add that in this scene. We'll start by turning the lights off. So select one of those rectangle lights, go to the Modify panel, and disable the on switch. Those lights are all instances, so they all turned off. In this physical camera view, all the lights are turned off, and there is no environment. And additionally, we are displaying the environment as the viewport background. If we go to Views, Viewport Background, we have it set to Environment Background. And if all of those conditions are met, no lights, no environment, and displaying the environment as the background, then we will get a black screen. No rendering whatsoever. So now let's increase the environment color and give it some ambient light. Go into the Rendering menu, to Environment. At the top of the Environment tab, in Common Parameters, we see Background Color. Click on that color swatch and increase the whiteness to its maximum and click OK. We've got some environment lighting in our viewport, and the viewport background is also the same color. Let's see what this looks like in a production rendering. On the main toolbar, we've got some teapot icons. Render Production is the teapot with a little lightning bolt on it. Click on that button. I've set this up to render the physical camera using the Arnold renderer with draft quality settings. Let's let that finish rendering. When it's finished, let's make a copy of this window. So click to Clone Rendered Frame Window, and we make a clone. We can close the original window and keep the clone. Let's see if we can improve the quality of the viewport to better match the production rendering. Let's go into the shading menu for the viewports. It's currently labeled User Defined. Go to Per View Presets. Previously in the course, I disabled an option in here, Progressive Skylight. I turned that off to save a little bit of performance in the viewport. Turn that back on again. And now we get the semblance of shadows from our environment light. But it's still not quite right. It's kind of overexposed in some areas, especially on the floor here. That's coming from this switch over here, Reflections from Environment. Let's turn that off. And that's a bit of a blessing and a curse. It's helped quite a lot with the overall brightness. We're not getting that blasted out reflection. But now we don't have any reflections at all, and therefore surfaces like these window frames don't render correctly. They just show up as black. Also, disabling reflections from environment revealed another problem, which is this light leak near the corners here. And that's simply because the shadows are not very accurate. If I turn shadows off and then back on again, that'll sort of illustrate how that white light leak is a result of inaccurate shadows from the environment. I want to point out an issue that may occur with reflections from environment. Turn that back on again. And let's go back to our background color. Set that to black temporarily. Bring that down, all the way down. So it's got a value of 0. Click OK. And let's go into the Views menu to Viewport Background and set it to Solid Color. And we get a solid color in the background, a neutral gray that we set up in our Customize User Interface dialog. But also, for some reason now, we have light in our scene. Well, that's coming from this Reflections from Environment. This is kind of a tricky switch. It should actually be labeled Reflections from Viewport Background. At least in this version of Max that I'm currently using, the viewport background itself is being reflected in surfaces. And so we want to try to stay away from this situation. Combining reflections from environment with a gradient or a solid color background is going to give us a spurious result that does not match our production rendering in any way. So if I am using a solid color or gradient background, I'm probably going to want to disable reflections from environment. Having done that, I still see a couple of objects showing reflections, and that's actually a bug in this version of Max. It has to do with cutout maps on a physical material. But anyway, usually turning off reflections from environment will solve the problem of the solid color or gradient background affecting the shading in the viewport. Okay, I'll turn that back on. And in the Views menu, go back to Viewport Background, Environment Background. And currently, in this version of Max, the only setting that is anything close to what you see is what you get, is Viewport Background, Environment Background. Okay, we've got no lights, no environment, and once again, it's rendering as black in the viewport. We'll bring our background color back up to white. And we can experiment with our settings. Once again, we can go into the Viewport Settings window and turn reflections from environment off again and on again and see which we like. All right, we'll leave it on for the moment. And let's turn our lights back on again too. So select one of the lights and back in the Modify panel, re-enable its on switch. And now we've got this set up probably the best that we can. Let's do another rendering and see if that matches. Render production from the main toolbar. When that rendering completes, we can compare it to the viewport render. The viewport rendering is never going to match the production rendering perfectly. We're always going to need to use a production render or maybe active shade in the viewport in order to really see what our lighting is going to look like. And currently there is no way to separate the viewport background from environment lighting while preserving reflections in the viewport. But as we saw, those reflections aren't really very accurate anyway, so we may want to sacrifice those. And in that case, it's fine for us to switch our viewport background back to solid color if we want. Now the good news is that we can separate the rendered background from the rendered environment lighting and not sacrifice anything. And the solutions for that include creating a skylight or using a special map in the environment slot. The skylight method is renderer specific. You'll need to use a different type of light depending upon which renderer you're using. To be as renderer agnostic as possible, we'll use a shading node in this environment map. We'll take a look at that in the following movies.